Hey guys, we are going to finish up on our Module 2 information here today. We're going to look at some microbial ecology. Now, up to this point, we've seen a lot of variety among these microbes. We talked about how all of the different metabolic pathways that exist, how it is that some organisms possess certain enzymes to allow them to perform those pathways, and some do not. And some have 2 or 3 ways to use the sugars and the nutrients in their world. We've also learned that abiotic factors play a big role. Temperature, pH, radiation, all of these different things also play a big role. So there's a huge array of different kinds of organisms, and they're living off of each other. Some of them are in complete conflict with one another. Some of them have symbiotic relationships that allow each of them to grow better and to thrive. And this is what microbial ecology is all about. The definition of ecology is the study of the relationship of organisms to each other and their environment. So when you add the and their environment, that adds the abiotic factors in. Ecology is a messy study, is a messy field. Even if you study ecology out in a forest and you're concentrating on fox population and rabbit population and population of different trees, these are all macroscopic things we can study. Now we dive into this microscopic world, and it's just amazing. It really is amazing, the complexity, and we haven't even barely scratched the surface of what is going on out there. Okay? So let's just get some basic definitions down when it comes to ecology. Population, we need to have a good definition for a population. So a population is all of one species in a particular geographical region or location. Okay? So all of one type of organism, one species in a particular place. That is a population, right? So we could talk about a population of E. coli and talk about that population in a test tube or in a broth or on an agar plate. We can talk about the population of humans on Earth, right? We could take whatever species we want and talk about that population. But then when we start to look at all of the populations, all of the various species, in other words, in a particular area or geographical location, we're talking about a community, okay? So a community, in this room right here, there's a bunch of bacteria growing naturally on my skin. There are bacteria in my mouth and my gut. These hopefully are all beneficial, either mutual, we're living for one another and helping one another, or commensal, in which case maybe some of these bacteria are thriving and I'm not necessarily getting anything out of their existence. And I really hope there's no pathogens in there, right? So that kind of parasitism going on. But all of these different kinds of symbiotic and non-symbiotic relationships exist within a community. So a community is all populations in a region, all species in one region. Then we get to an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is taking the community in a particular place, and it's adding in the abiotic factors. Okay? So an ecosystem are all the biotic and all the abiotic factors. Abiotic, we're talking the humidity in the air, we're talking temperature, we're talking any variety of different things, radiation in the air, all those kinds of things. Okay? Now, oftentimes the abiotic factors are a rather large factor in whether an organism can grow or not. It is the limiting factor, let's say, right? If we learned this already, if we have a mannitol salt agar plate, there's a certain amount of salt there, and if you cannot survive that amount of salt, you're done, right? Okay, so all those organisms that can't survive that abiotic factor are done. They're not going to be able to survive, and therefore they won't have to, the other organisms that won't have to compete with those organisms that are non-halophiles, to give you an example. All right, so something you probably learned way back in an earlier biology class are trophic pyramids. The idea that there is kind of a food chain, right? And what I like to talk about are what these levels actually are composed of. So we could look at primary producers, okay? Primary producers could also be referred to as, for the most part, not all of them, but many of them, what we think about when we hear primary producers are the photoautotrophs. Okay, so now we're taking terms we used earlier in this module 2, classifications of how organisms get their energy. We say chemo or photo, and how organisms get their carbon for growing bigger. And then we go auto or hetero. So if we talk about the primary producers, one big group that we could be talking about would be those organisms that get their energy from the sun, photo, and they grab inorganic forms of carbon, like carbon dioxide out of the air, and they use that to make sugars, right? Through photosynthesis. And this would be all of the plants and other green unicellular organisms, and we tend to discount those because we can see a big tree out the window and the grass on the ground, but it so happens that there's far more green unicellular organisms in the ocean than there is autotrophs, photoautotrophs on land, okay? So these organisms do a good job of pulling down a lot of energy straight from the sun, okay? And that energy goes into making bonds, these chemical bonds, to make that organism grow bigger, right? Now, past that point, we tend to lose more and more energy. We can only pull down so much energy from the sun and harness it through the photoautotrophs, but then each level, each trophic level we go up from there, we lose 10%, okay? So here we have a loss going from 10,000 to 1,000, right? Here we have another loss going from 1,000 to 100. Now, this isn't measured in joules. This is a measure of energy. I wouldn't worry too much about it. But the point is that you're going down by a level of 10% each time, right? Now, all of these would be considered consumers. For the most part, chemoheterotrophs. Chemo, they get their energy from the chemical energy in the food they eat, break those bonds, get more ATP. But they also use the food they eat as a carbon source, right? What this basically means is that if you were to eat something in a second or third level for dinner tonight, so basically if you eat anything other than plants, let's say, right? So you have a nice big salad, you're getting these primary producers, and they have a lot of energy, okay? The more we eat of animals that are up a level or two from those primary producers, the less efficient we're being, okay? So if you look at a vegetarian, they're really doing something very smart, whether they are doing it for that reason or not. They are being much more efficient in their intake, and pound for pound, if you take a pound of salad and a pound of steak, you're getting more out of that pound of salad, okay, when it comes to energy. Okay. How complex can this set of trophic levels get? Well, it can get enormously complex. here we have the difference between a food chain and a food web, okay? So a food chain, we see here on the bottom right, we have these producers, these primary producers, like algae and other phytoplankton and all sorts of really small green unicellular photosynthetic organisms, and they would be consumed by herbivores, and then they would be consumed by carnivores, right? Now, an herbivore and a carnivore would both be consumers, right? But the herbivore would be more on the level of a primary consumer, secondary consumer for the carnivores and every carnivore that exists above that. And of course, humans are oftentimes at the pinnacle of these trophic cascades, these trophic levels, okay? So you should know the difference between a food chain, like the one that we just kind of talked about here, going from producers in the water all the way to the fish that a human might eat, and then a food web, where you have something like you see over here on the other side of the slide, right? Where it can get very, very complex, lots of different organisms, some of which can eat 10, 20 different kinds of other organisms, and it gets really, really complex. All right, so food chain, one set of trophic interactions would be a good definition. A food web, all sets of trophic interactions that might occur. All right. Now, one interesting book that you might consider looking at is The Omnivore's Dilemma. And this is a book that was written by a scientific writer and with a lot of research. And I think there was a gentleman that does work at Cornell that also was involved. And Michael Pollan talks about a lot of different, the history of what different civilizations used to eat. And, we generally tend to accept the idea that eating more plants and, fruits and vegetables is better for you. And in fact, some would go on to say that to eat any meat is not necessarily a good thing. But in general, we would say that the human population are a combination of people that are eating both plants and meat in combination. So they're an omnivore. And the interesting thing about this book is that there are civilizations where meat and blubber from whales and things like that were the primary source of energy, where they got very little plants in their diet, and yet they were very healthy people. Okay, so it's a really interesting book that you might want to check out. All right, next time we tune in, we're going to get into the elemental cycles, and we'll be done for Module 2.